Captain Threx Voss had seen many wrecks in his long career, but none of them made his skin crawl the way this one did. The ship floated alone in the dark, far from any star, far from any world. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of his own cruiser, and it drifted like a dead thing, silent and cold. Its hull was scorched black in places, torn open in others. Long streaks of frozen metal trailed behind it like blood from an old wound. There were no lights, no signals, no heat. By every reading his sensors could give him, the ship was empty, dead, abandoned. And yet something about it refused to feel truly dead. Threx stood on the bridge of his own vessel, the Ashen Claw, staring at the wreck on the main screen. His race, the Doran, had been fighting the humans of Earth for 11 long cycles, 11 years, in the human way of counting time. It had started as a border dispute, a small skirmish over a mining colony neither side truly needed. It had grown into something much larger, much bloodier, and much more confusing than anyone on either side had expected. The Doran were not a young species. They had fought and conquered a dozen other civilizations before ever meeting Earth. They knew how wars were supposed to go. A stronger fleet arrived, a weaker fleet either surrendered or was destroyed, and the war ended in a matter of months. That was the pattern. That was the way it had always worked. Humans had broken the pattern. Threx's science officer, a thin, pale-scaled Doran named Ulyss, approached him with a datapad in hand. "Captain, the wreck is confirmed to be human. Design matches vessels from their so-called Fourth Fleet. Hull markings suggest it is the UES Meridian, a heavy warship." "Any life signs?" Threx asked. "None, Captain. No power. No heat signatures beyond the natural cooling from what appears to be an old battle. Whatever happened here, it happened months ago, maybe longer." Threx narrowed his eyes at the screen. The Meridian. He knew that name. Every Doran captain in this sector knew that name. 6 months ago, the Meridian had been part of a small human fleet that had gone up against a Doran strike force nearly 4 times its size. By every rule of war Threx understood, the humans should have died in minutes. Instead, the battle had lasted almost 2 full days. The Doran strike force had been reduced to 1/3 of its original number by the time it finally withdrew. The Meridian and its sister ships had vanished afterward, presumed destroyed, their fate unknown. Now here it was, floating alone in the dark, wounded but whole. "Send a full sensor sweep," Threx ordered. "I want to know everything about this ship before we go near it." The sweep took almost an hour. When it was finished, Ulyss returned with more questions than answers. "Captain, the reactor core is dark but intact. Weapon systems show heavy damage, most are destroyed. Life support is offline throughout the ship, and yet..." Ulyss hesitated. "And yet what?" "There are pockets of the ship still sealed. Bulkheads closed from the inside. Several sections show no damage at all, as if the crew fought to protect them specifically." Ulyss looked up from the pad. "Captain, this was not a ship destroyed in battle. This was a ship that fought until it could fight no more, and then it was left. Deliberately." Threx felt something cold settle in his chest, though he could not have said why. He had captured dozens of enemy ships in his career. He had walked through the silent halls of defeated warships from a dozen different species. None of them had ever made him feel like this. "Prepare a boarding team," he said. "I want to see this ship for myself." The airlock groaned as it opened, metal against metal, the sound echoing strangely in the vacuum-cold corridor beyond. Threx stepped through first, his boots clanging on the deck plating, his suit lights cutting twin beams through the darkness. Behind him came 4 of his best soldiers, weapons ready, and Ulyss, carrying a portable scanner. The corridor was a mess. Scorch marks covered the walls. Debris floated gently in the absence of gravity, small pieces of metal and shattered glass, and things Threx did not want to look at too closely. There was a strange stillness to the place, a silence that felt heavier than ordinary silence, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. "Careful," Threx said over the comm. "Watch for traps. Humans are known for leaving surprises behind." It was not paranoia. In the 11 years of this war, the Doran had learned many hard lessons about human tactics. Humans did not fight the way the Doran expected an inferior enemy to fight. They did not simply flee when outmatched. They did not simply surrender when cornered. They improvised. They adapted. They found ways to turn their own weaknesses into weapons. More than one Doran boarding party had walked into what looked like an empty, defeated ship, only to be met with hidden charges, sealed traps, or worse. But as Threx's team moved deeper into the Meridian, they found no such surprises. Only wreckage. Only the aftermath of a battle that had clearly been fought to its absolute limit. They passed through what had once been crew quarters, now stripped bare, personal items floating loose in the dark. They passed through a medbay, its equipment shattered, dark stains on the floor that Threx chose not to examine too closely. They passed through a long cargo hold, empty except for a few crumpled shipping containers. "Captain," Euless said, his voice tight, "I am picking up a faint power signature. Small, but active. It is coming from the command deck." Threx felt that cold feeling in his chest again. "Lead the way." The command deck of the Meridian was larger than Threx had expected, a wide circular room with stations arranged around a central holographic table, now dark and lifeless. Most of the consoles were destroyed, their screens shattered, their frames blackened by fire. But one station, tucked in a corner near the back of the room, still glowed faintly with a dim red light. Threx approached it carefully, his weapon lowered but not holstered. As he got closer, he could see it was some kind of terminal, connected to a small independent power cell that had somehow survived the destruction of the rest of the ship. A single word blinked on its cracked screen, over and over, patient and unyielding. "Recording." "Euless," Threx said quietly. "What is this?" The science officer moved to the terminal and ran his scanner over it. "It appears to be the ship's command log, Captain. A backup system, isolated from the main network, specifically to survive damage to the rest of the vessel. It has its own power source. That is why it still functions." He paused, studying the readout. "There are hundreds of hours of recorded entries here. Voice logs, mostly. Personal reports made by the ship's commanding officer throughout the engagement, and some from before it as well." Threx stared at the small red light for a long moment. Something about it unsettled him more than all the wreckage they had passed through to reach it. This was not debris. This was not the leftover mess of a battle. This was something the humans had built to survive. Something they had built so that even after everything else was gone, their voices would remain. "Play it," Threx said, "from the beginning." Ewells hesitated. "Captain, are you certain? We do not know what—" "Play it." The science officer's fingers moved across the terminal. There was a brief burst of static, and then a voice filled the command deck, clear and steady despite the damage to the equipment that had recorded it. A human voice. A woman's voice. "Captain's log. UES Meridian. Captain Sarah Reyes. Recording. Stardate irrelevant. Ship's clock reads day 1 of deployment to the Kessin corridor. We've received orders from Fleet Command to hold this position against an anticipated Doran advance. I won't lie in this log, not to myself, and not to whoever might listen to it someday. Our chances here are not good. Intelligence reports put the enemy force at 3 to 4 times our strength. But orders are orders, and there are 17 human mining colonies behind us that have nowhere else to run. So we hold. That's the job. That's what we signed up for." The voice paused. Threx found himself leaning closer to the terminal, though he could not have said why. "My crew doesn't know the odds yet. I'll tell them at the briefing tonight. I imagine some of them already suspect. They're good people. Scared people, some of them, but good. I've served with worse crews on better odds. We'll make do. We always do." The recording ended. Silence filled the command deck once more, broken only by the faint hum of Threx's own suit systems. "Captain?" Euless said carefully. "Shall I continue?" Threx did not answer right away. He was thinking about the numbers Euless had mentioned. 3 to 4 times their strength. That matched what he already knew about the battle that had crippled his own people's strike force. He had always assumed the Doran victory in that engagement, such as it was, had come at a heavier cost than expected, simply due to bad luck, or perhaps overconfidence on the part of the strike force commander. He had never considered that the humans might have known from the very first day that they were facing impossible odds, and had chosen to stand and fight regardless. It did not fit the pattern. It did not fit anything Threx understood about how wars were supposed to be fought. "Continue," he said finally. "Play the next entry." The terminal hummed, and Captain Sarah Reyes's voice returned, this time recorded a full day later according to the timestamp. Her tone was different now, sharper, more focused. Captain's log, day 2. Briefed the crew this morning. Told them everything. The odds, the mission, what's at stake if we fail. I watched their faces while I talked. I want to say I saw fear, and I did, some of it. But mostly, I saw something else. Determination, maybe. Or stubbornness. Command Sergeant Okafor put it best afterward, when we were alone in the corridor. He said, "Captain, we've been staring down bad odds since the day this species crawled out of the mud. This is just another Tuesday." I laughed. First time I'd laughed in a week. We're going to need that kind of thinking in the days ahead. Engineering reports all systems nominal, though Chief Engineer Vasquez has some concerns about the reactor's output under sustained combat conditions. I've asked her to look into ways we might be able to push past standard safety limits, if the situation calls for it. She didn't like that request. I don't blame her. But I'd rather have the option and not need it, than need it and not have it. Weapons is running drills around the clock. Lieutenant Chen has some unconventional ideas about how we might use the asteroid field at the edge of the corridor to our advantage, should the enemy approach from that vector. I've told him to keep developing the concept. In a fight like this one, we're going to need every advantage we can find, conventional or otherwise. That's it for today. Tomorrow we finish preparations. After that, we wait, and hope the enemy takes their time getting here. The recording clicked off. Threx stood very still, absorbing what he had just heard. There was something in the woman's voice that he had not expected. Not the desperate bravado of a soldier trying to convince herself everything would be fine. Not the cold detachment of a commander who had already accepted her own death. It was something else entirely. Something Threx did not have a good word for in his own language. A kind of clear-eyed acceptance of terrible odds, combined with a refusal to simply lie down and let those odds decide the outcome. He had fought humans for 11 years. He had killed them, and he had watched them kill Doran soldiers under his command. And in all that time, he had never once stopped to wonder what it was that made them fight the way they did. He had simply accepted, as every Doran accepted, that humans were dangerous, unpredictable, and stubborn beyond all reason, and that the safest way to deal with them was overwhelming force, applied as early and as often as possible. He had never once listened to one of them explain, in their own words, why they kept fighting. "Ools," he said slowly. "How many entries are in this log?" The science officer checked his scanner. 211, Captain. Spanning approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Threx did the calculation in his head. The battle that had crippled the Doran strike force had lasted less than 2 days, according to the official reports he had read. If this log spanned 6 weeks, then whatever had happened aboard the Meridian had begun long before that final engagement. "Copy the entire log to my own systems," Threx ordered. "All of it. I want to hear every word." "Yes, Captain. May I ask why?" Threx looked around the darkened command deck, at the scorched walls and the shattered consoles and the small, stubborn red light that had somehow survived everything the universe had thrown at it, just so that a dead woman's voice could keep speaking to whoever came looking. "Because I think," he said quietly, "that we have been fighting an enemy we do not understand at all, and I intend to understand them, whatever it costs." Behind him, his soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them spoke. Euless simply nodded and began the transfer, and somewhere deep in the wounded body of the Meridian, Captain Sarah Reyes's voice waited patiently to tell the rest of her story, one entry at a time, to an enemy who had finally decided to listen. Threx did not know it yet, standing there in the cold and the dark, but the next several days would change everything he thought he understood about the war he had spent 11 years fighting. They would change how he saw his enemy, how he saw his own people, and eventually, how he saw himself. The logbook of the UES Meridian was about to become the most important thing he had ever found, and he had only heard the very beginning. He gave the order to return to the Ashenclaw, the copied logs secure in Ulyss's data core, and as the boarding team retreated back through the silent corridors of the dead warship, Threx found himself glancing back over his shoulder more than once, as if some part of him expected the ship to follow. It did not, of course. It simply drifted there in the dark, patient and silent, keeping its remaining secrets for another day. Threx listened to the logs alone in his quarters that night, the lights turned low, a cup of untouched sesh tea growing cold beside him. He had told his crew he needed rest. He had not slept at all. The entries continued in order, day by day, and slowly a picture began to form in Threx's mind, a picture very different from the one he had carried with him for 11 years of war. Captain's log, day 9. Enemy scouts spotted at the edge of the corridor this morning. 3 light cruisers, keeping their distance. Lieutenant Chen believes they're gathering targeting data for a larger force following behind. I agree with his assessment. I've ordered the fleet to hold position and show no aggression. Let them think we're exactly as weak as their intelligence probably tells them we are. No point revealing our hand before we have to. Had a long talk with Chief Vasquez about the reactor modifications. She's found a way to boost output by nearly 30% for short bursts, though it'll put serious strain on the containment systems. Risky, but it might be the edge we need if things get desperate. I've authorized her to proceed, on the condition that we only use it as an absolute last resort. Morale aboard ship is complicated. I won't pretend everyone is calm. We had our first disciplinary incident today, nothing serious, just 2 crewmen letting the stress get to them and coming to blows over something trivial. I've spoken to both of them personally, rather than handing it to Sergeant Okafor. Sometimes people just need someone to listen. I try to remember that, even when I'm running on no sleep myself. Threx paused the recording there, turning the words over in his mind. Sometimes people just need someone to listen. It was such a small thing to say, such an ordinary thing, and yet it struck him as strange coming from the commander of a warship facing annihilation. Doran captains did not concern themselves with the emotional troubles of individual crew members, not during a crisis of this scale. There were protocols for discipline. There were protocols for morale. Personal attention from the commanding officer was considered inefficient, a waste of resources better spent on tactical planning. And yet here was Sarah Reyes, a woman staring down a fleet 3 or 4 times her own strength, taking the time to personally speak with 2 crewmen over a minor scuffle. He resumed the recording. Captain's log, day 14. Enemy main force has entered the corridor. Initial count puts them at roughly 70 vessels, more than our sensors first estimated. We are 22 ships. I won't pretend those numbers don't scare me, because they do. But I've made my decision, and I'm recording it here for the record, in case anyone ever needs to know why. We could retreat. Fleet Command has given us that option, technically. A tactical withdrawal to consolidate with the main fleet 3 systems away. On paper, it's the smart move. It's what the numbers say we should do. But if we retreat, the Doran fleet takes this corridor without a fight, and from here they have a clear path to 17 mining colonies, with a combined population of over 200,000 people. Most of those colonies have no defenses of their own. They were never meant to need any, not with the Meridian and her sister ships standing guard. So we're staying. I've informed the crew. I won't lie and say they took it easily, but I didn't expect them to. What I will say is that not one person asked to be reassigned. Not one. I don't know if that makes me proud, or if it just makes me feel the weight of what I'm asking of them even more. Maybe both. Threx set down his cup of cold tea, his hands very still. 200,000 people. He had known, in an abstract way, that the human mining colonies in that region existed. Doran intelligence had catalogued them years ago as future targets, resources to be secured once the military situation allowed. He had never once considered them as people, families, individuals with names and faces and lives, the way Sarah Reyes clearly considered them. He thought of his own people, his own homeworld, and tried to imagine a Doran commander making the same choice Reyes had made. 22 ships against 70. In order to protect a population that would likely never even know their names. It was not a decision that made tactical sense. It was not a decision any Doran officer would have been trained to make. And yet, listening to her voice, Threx did not hear a woman who regretted her choice. He heard someone who had made peace with it, however difficult that peace might have been to find. He kept listening. Captain's log, day 15. First contact with the enemy vanguard. They probed our formation with a squadron of destroyers, testing our response. We let them get close, closer than standard doctrine would suggest, and then Lieutenant Chen's asteroid field plan paid off for the first time. We drew 3 of their destroyers into a debris cluster we'd seeded with mines over the past week, lost none of our own ships, destroyed 2 of theirs outright, crippled a 3rd. It's a small victory, and I know it. 70 ships still remain out there, -2. But small victories matter. They matter to morale, and more importantly, they buy us time to learn how this enemy fights. Their commander is cautious, methodical. He's not going to throw his whole fleet at us in one reckless charge. That gives us room to work. Threx found himself almost smiling, a strange, unfamiliar expression on his own face. He remembered receiving the reports of that skirmish, back when he had still been serving as a junior officer under a different command. The official Doran assessment had called it an unfortunate but minor setback, the result of poor scouting discipline by the destroyer squadron involved. No one had considered it a deliberate trap, carefully planned and executed by an enemy that understood exactly how a cautious, methodical Doran commander would behave. The humans had been studying them, learning them, adapting to them, in real time, even as the battle unfolded. He continued through the entries, each one adding another piece to the picture. Reyes recorded not just tactical decisions but the small human details of life aboard a warship under siege. A crewman's birthday celebrated with rationed sweets from the galley. A young engineer who wrote letters to a sister back on Earth, letters that would never be sent, because there was no one left to carry them. A medic who insisted on learning the name of every wounded crew member personally, no matter how many there were, because she believed it helped them heal faster to be seen as people, and not just patients. Threx had never heard anything like it. Doran military logs were terse, functional documents, records of decisions and outcomes with no room for anything else. He had always assumed, without ever quite thinking about it directly, that human military records would be much the same, simply less disciplined, less organized. He had not expected this. He had not expected a record that felt, in its own strange way, less like a war log, and more like the diary of someone trying desperately to hold together not just a battle plan, but a community of frightened, determined people who trusted her with their lives. Captain's log, day 19. Enemy pressure increasing. They've adjusted their approach, sending smaller, faster groups to probe multiple points in our formation simultaneously. Smart. Their commander is learning from his mistakes, same as we're learning from ours. Lost the Corsair today, all 41 crew. I knew most of them by name. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't hurt, because it does, and if it ever stops hurting, that's the day I stop being fit to command. Held a memorial service this evening, brief, just a few words over the comm system to the whole fleet. I told them the truth, that the Corsair's crew bought us 6 hours of confusion in the enemy's formation, 6 hours that let the rest of us reposition and avoid what would likely have been a much worse outcome. Their sacrifice meant something. I need my crew to believe that, because it's true, and because they need something to hold on to right now. Threx stopped the recording again. He sat in the dim light of his quarters for a long moment, turning something over in his mind that he had never quite examined before. In 11 years of war, he had killed humans, many humans. He had commanded engagements that had cost thousands of human lives, and he had never once thought of them as anything more than enemy combatants, statistics in a campaign report, obstacles between the Doran Empire and its expansion into this region of space. He had told himself, as every Doran officer told himself, that this was simply the nature of war, that sentiment had no place in military strategy, that the enemy's grief was not his concern. But listening to Sarah Reyes speak about the crew of the Corsair, 41 people she had known by name, people whose deaths she carried with her even as she continued to plan and fight and hold her position, Threx found it much harder to maintain the comfortable distance he had always kept between himself and the humans he fought. He resumed the log, and the entries continued, day after day, battle after battle. The Doran fleet pressed forward. The human defenders held, adapted, struck back where they could, retreated where they had to, and slowly, entry by entry, Threx watched a fleet of 22 ships whittle down a force of 70, through nothing but cleverness, desperation, and an absolute refusal to simply accept defeat. Captain's log, day 26. We are down to 16 ships. Enemy force, by our best estimate, is down to roughly 50. The math is still against us, badly against us, but it's better math than it was 2 weeks ago. Chief Vasquez tells me the reactor modifications are holding up better than expected. Lieutenant Chen has 3 more tricks up his sleeve that I won't record here, in case this log ever falls into enemy hands, though I doubt it will. Threx felt an odd twist of something almost like guilt at those words. The log had fallen into enemy hands. It had fallen into his hands specifically, and he was listening to every word of it, learning everything Sarah Reyes had ever tried to hide from people exactly like him. And yet he could not stop listening. He needed to know how the story ended. He needed to understand what had happened to this woman, this crew, this ship that had fought so hard for so long against such impossible odds. Captain's log, day 31. Something the crew doesn't know yet. Something I'm still deciding whether to tell them. Fleet Command has confirmed there will be no reinforcements. The main fleet is engaged elsewhere, a larger offensive we weren't briefed on until now. We are, for all practical purposes, on our own out here. Whatever happens in this corridor happens because of what we do, and nothing else. I keep thinking about something my father used to say, back when I was a kid on the Nebraska plains, long before any of this, before I'd ever seen a starship or heard the word Doran. He used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do when nobody's coming to help them, and they have to decide for themselves whether to stand or run. I think about that a lot these days. I haven't told the crew about the reinforcements yet. I will, tomorrow, at the morning briefing. They deserve to know the truth, even when the truth is hard. Maybe especially then. Threx paused the recording one final time that night, unable to continue. He sat alone in the dim light of his quarters, the cold tea forgotten beside him, and for the first time in 11 years of war, he found himself wondering what kind of species he had truly been fighting all this time. He had assumed weakness, disorganization, an enemy that fought out of desperation and nothing more. He had assumed the humans' occasional victories were flukes, exceptions, the kind of statistical anomalies that occurred in any large enough conflict. But this was not the record of a desperate, disorganized enemy. This was the record of a commander who understood exactly what she was facing, who told her people the truth even when the truth was terrible, who grieved for every loss and pushed forward anyway, not out of blind stubbornness, but out of a clear, deliberate choice to protect something she believed was worth protecting. Threx thought of the 200,000 people in those 17 mining colonies, people who would likely never know Sarah Reyes's name, and he thought of his own orders, his own mission in this sector, and for the first time in his career, he felt something uncomfortably close to shame. He did not sleep that night. He simply sat in the dark, and when morning came, he returned to his command chair, gave the necessary orders to keep his ship on its patrol route, and retreated to his quarters again, the moment his duties allowed, eager and afraid in equal measure to hear what came next. The story of the Meridian was far from over, and Threx Voss, captain of the Doran cruiser, Ashenclaw, found that he needed to know how it ended, no matter what that ending might cost him. 3 days passed before Threx returned to the logs. He told himself it was because his duties as captain demanded his attention. Patrol schedules, supply reports, the routine business of commanding a warship in wartime. But the truth, which he admitted to no one, not even Ulysse, was that he needed time to think about what he had already heard before he could bear to hear more. On the 4th night, he sat down again in his quarters, the lights low, and resumed the recording where he had left it. Captain's log, day 32. Told the crew about the reinforcements this morning. No help is coming. I watched their faces while I said it, same as I did when I told them the odds on day 1. This time, something was different. Less shock, more resolve. I think, somewhere along the way these past weeks, we stopped being a crew waiting to see if we'd survive, and became a crew who'd already decided what we were willing to give for this fight. That's a strange thing to feel proud of, but I do. Chief Vasquez came to see me privately after the briefing. She's worried about reactor stability if we keep pushing the modified output levels much longer. I told her I understood the risk. She looked at me for a long moment, and then said, "Understood isn't the same as accepted, Captain. She's right, of course, but I don't see another option. We push forward, or we lose everything behind us. Those are the only 2 choices left." Threx listened, and something in him recognized the particular weight in Sarah Reyes's voice, a weight he had heard before in the voices of his own officers during difficult campaigns. It was the sound of someone carrying responsibility for lives that were not fully in their control, making decisions they knew might be wrong, but making them anyway because someone had to. He had always believed that quality, that willingness to bear terrible responsibility, was a mark of good leadership among his own people. He had never considered that humans might carry the same weight, feel the same doubts, and still find the strength to act regardless. The recording continued. Captain's log, day 36. Enemy has changed tactics again. Their commander has stopped probing and started committing to full engagements. I think he's running out of patience, or running out of time himself. Pressure from his own command structure, maybe. Whatever the reason, the fighting has gotten worse. We lost the Halcyon and the Meridian's Pride today, sister ship, different from us despite the name. 63 crew between them. I knew most of the Halcyon's senior staff personally. Captain Ose and I trained together at the academy, years ago. He had 2 kids back on Mars. I don't know how I'm going to write that letter. There was a long pause in the recording, several seconds of silence, before Reyes's voice returned, steadier now, though something in its tone had changed. I will write it, though. Every letter, for every crew member we lose. That's a promise I made myself on day 1 of this command, and I intend to keep it as long as I'm able. They deserve that much. Their families deserve that much. Threx found himself gripping the edge of his own console without quite realizing he had done so. He thought of the letters, dozens of them by now, that Sarah Reyes must have written in the quiet hours between battles, informing families across a dozen human worlds and colonies that their sons and daughters, husbands and wives, were not coming home. He wondered if any of those letters had ever actually reached their destinations, or if they, like the ship itself, had simply been lost to the silence of deep space, unsent, unread, another casualty of a war that had cost far more than either side's official reports would ever fully capture. Captain's log, day 41. We are down to 11 ships. Enemy force is down to roughly 30, by our best count, though their numbers are harder to track now that we're deep into close-quarters engagements. Lieutenant Chen was wounded in yesterday's fighting, shrapnel to the shoulder, nothing life-threatening, but he's confined to the medical bay for at least another day. Ensign Torres has taken over tactical in his absence, and is doing an admirable job, though I can tell the pressure is getting to her. She's 23 years old. 3 months ago she was fresh out of the academy, expecting a peacetime posting doing sensor calibration on some quiet border station. Now she's running combat tactics for what's left of a fleet fighting for its life. I told her this morning that I have complete confidence in her. I meant it. Threx paused the recording, thinking about the age Reyes had mentioned. 23 years, in human counting, was young even by Doran standards, barely past the age when a Doran citizen would begin formal military training. He tried to imagine a Doran ensign of similar age and experience being trusted with tactical command during a desperate, ongoing engagement, and found he could not picture it. Doran command structures were rigid, built on decades of seniority and proven experience. The idea of trusting someone so young with so much responsibility, particularly during a crisis, ran counter to everything Threx had been taught about how a military should function. And yet, listening to the logs, it was clear that this was not some desperate last resort, born of having no other options. Reyes spoke of Ensign Torres with genuine confidence, genuine respect, as though the young woman's age was simply irrelevant next to her demonstrated ability. It was, Threx realized slowly, another piece of the same pattern he had been noticing throughout the entire log. Humans seemed to value capability and character over rigid hierarchy, in a way that Doran society simply did not. He continued listening, hour after hour, night after night, as the pattern of the log entries began to shift. The early recordings had been longer, more reflective, filled with details about crew morale and tactical planning, and the small human moments that made up daily life aboard a warship. As the days wore on and the battle intensified, the entries grew shorter, more clipped, recorded in the brief lulls between engagements by a woman who clearly had less and less time to spare for anything beyond the immediate demands of survival. Captain's log, day 47. 8 ships remaining. Enemy down to approximately 20. Reactor output holding. Barely. No time for more. More later, if there is a later. Captain's log, day 52. 6 ships. Lost the Wanderer in the last engagement. All hands. I don't have time to write what I want to write about them. I'll do it properly later. I have to believe there will be a later. Captain's log, day 58. 4 ships remain. Enemy fleet down to roughly 12, though I suspect reinforcements may be en route to them. given their commander's recent behavior. We're running out of tricks. Running out of everything, honestly. But we're still here. Still standing. That has to count for something. Threx found himself leaning forward, unable to look away from the small terminal, even though there was nothing to see. Only Sarah Reyes's voice, growing more tired with each entry, but never once losing the thread of determination that ran through every word she spoke. He thought about the numbers. 4 ships remaining against what might soon become a reinforced enemy fleet. He knew, from his own service records, roughly when this battle had reached its final, catastrophic conclusion. He knew, in the broadest terms, how the story ended, because he had read the official door and after action reports years ago, back when the destruction of the human corridor fleet had been celebrated as a hard-won but ultimately decisive Doran victory. What he had not known, what those reports had never bothered to include, was any of this. Any of the names, the voices, the small acts of courage and grief and stubborn hope that had filled every single day of this impossible fight. The official reports had reduced an entire fleet, an entire crew of thousands of individual human beings, into a single line of acceptable losses in a campaign summary. Threx thought about how many times he had read similar reports over the years, how many times he had nodded along with casualty figures and tactical summaries without ever once wondering what those numbers actually represented. He thought about how easy it had been, for 11 years, to think of humans as a faceless enemy, a problem to be solved through superior force, rather than as individuals who bled and grieved and loved and fought for reasons that made perfect sense once you took the time to actually listen. He was not the same officer who had first boarded the Meridian. Only a few days ago, he could feel the change in himself, uncomfortable and unwelcome as it was, and he did not yet know what he was going to do about it. Captain's Log, Day 61. Reyes's voice was quieter now, more measured, as though she were choosing her words with particular care. Enemy reinforcements confirmed. 15 additional vessels have joined the main force, bringing their total back up to approximately 27 ships. We have 4. I've spent the last several hours running every tactical scenario I can think of, and I won't lie in this log, because I promised myself I never would. There is no scenario where 4 ships defeat 27, not through skill, not through tricks, not through anything I can think of. But there is a scenario where 4 ships buy enough time for the mining colonies behind us to complete their evacuation. Fleet Command has finally authorized emergency evacuation transports, 3 days out from the nearest colonies. 3 days. If we can hold this corridor for 3 more days, every person in those 17 colonies gets a chance to escape before the Doran fleet reaches them. I've called a meeting with my senior staff for this evening. I already know what I'm going to propose. I wanted to say it here, first, in my own words, before I say it to them. There was a long pause in the recording. Threx sat perfectly still, hardly breathing, waiting. I'm going to ask my crew to make the hardest choice any of us will ever face, and I already know, without asking, exactly what they're going to say. The recording ended there. Threx checked the timestamp, confirming there was indeed a gap before the next entry, nearly 6 hours according to the ship's internal clock. He sat in the silence of his own quarters for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. He thought about calling Ulyss, about asking his science officer's opinion on what might come next, but he found he did not want to share this moment with anyone else. Not yet. This felt, strangely, like something private. Something between himself and the voice of a woman who had died months ago, in a battle whose true cost Threx was only now beginning to understand. He reached for the console and, after a long moment of hesitation, pressed play on the next entry. The next entry began with the sound of a room full of people, quiet murmuring in the background, before Sarah Reyes's voice rose above it, addressing not the log directly, but her assembled senior staff, recorded live as it happened. I'm going to say this plainly, because we don't have time for anything else. Fleet Command needs 3 more days to complete the evacuation of the mining colonies. We have 4 ships and a fleet of 27 bearing down on us. I've run every scenario, and there is no version of this where all 4 ships survive an extended engagement. But there is a version where we survive long enough and hit hard enough to buy the colonies the time they need. A man's voice spoke next, older, gravelly. Threx recognized it from earlier entries as Command Sergeant Okafor. You're talking about the reactor overload plan, Vasquez's modifications. I am. Reyes confirmed. Chief Vasquez has confirmed the modified reactors on all 4 remaining ships can be pushed well past standard containment limits for a short, controlled burst, enough to punch through enemy shielding at a scale we haven't been able to manage until now. Enough, potentially, to take out a significant portion of their fleet in a single coordinated strike. A woman's voice, tight with tension, spoke up. Threx guessed this was Chief Engineer Vasquez herself. Captain, I need to be clear about what that means. Pushing the reactors that far isn't just risky. On 3 of the 4 ships, containment failure is almost certain once we exceed the threshold. We're not talking about a dangerous maneuver. We're talking about turning each ship into a weapon that detonates from the inside. Silence followed, heavy and long, before Reyes spoke again, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. I know what I'm asking. I want every person in this room, and every person on these 4 ships, to understand exactly what I'm asking. Because I won't order anyone into this. This has to be a choice, made with clear eyes, by people who understand exactly what they're choosing. Here's the plan, as I see it. We coordinate a strike formation, drawing the enemy fleet into close range, under the pretense of a standard engagement. At the moment of maximum enemy concentration, we trigger controlled reactor overloads on all 4 vessels simultaneously. The resulting energy discharge, according to Vasquez's calculations, should be sufficient to cripple or destroy the majority of their remaining fleet. The crew complement of all 4 ships will need to be reduced beforehand. We'll transfer as many personnel as possible to the 2 remaining shuttlecraft and send them toward the evacuation route, away from the engagement zone. That gets roughly 60 people to safety. The rest of us stay, to fly the ships and execute the maneuver. Another voice, younger, uncertain. Threx recognized this one too. Ensign Torres, the 23-year-old tactical officer Reyes had spoken of with such confidence. Captain, how many people are we talking about? Staying, I mean. Best estimate, 68. Reyes answered without hesitation, without softening the number in any way. 68 people, myself included, would need to remain aboard to execute this plan and give it any chance of success. The silence that followed stretched even longer than before. Threx found himself holding his breath, though there was no reason for a Doran physiology to require such a thing during a simple audio recording. He waited, along with the recorded voices of people who had been dead for months, to hear what would happen next. It was Sergeant Okafor who broke the silence first. Well, Captain, you already know my answer. I signed up to protect people who can't protect themselves. Can't think of a better way to finish the job than this. Count me in, said Vasquez, her voice quiet but firm. Someone competent needs to be at the reactor controls when this happens anyway. Might as well be me. One by one, voices spoke up around the room, each one volunteering, each one accepting the terrible choice Reyes had laid out before them with such honesty. Threx listened to name after name, rank after rank, ordinary people making an extraordinary decision, without hesitation, without complaint, simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. Then Ensign Torres spoke again, her young voice trembling slightly but clear. Captain, I want to stay too. I know I'm young. I know there are people here with more experience who could argue they're more useful in this than I am, but I want to be part of this. I want it recorded that I chose this, of my own will. There was a pause, and then Reyes's voice, softer now, carrying something that might have been pride, or grief, or both at once. Recorded, Ensign, thank you. The meeting continued for a while longer, working out logistics, assignments, the practical details of coordinating such a maneuver across 4 separate ships. Threx listened to all of it, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. 68 people had just volunteered, without hesitation, to die, in order to protect 200,000 strangers they would never meet, on colonies most of them had probably never even visited. He thought about his own people, his own culture, built on a foundation of conquest and expansion, and the belief that strength alone determined worth. He tried, and failed, to imagine a similar scene playing out aboard a Doran vessel. Senior officers and crew alike volunteering en masse for certain death in service of civilians they had never met. It was not that Doran soldiers lacked courage. Threx had commanded brave officers throughout his career, soldiers who had died following orders, who had sacrificed themselves in the heat of battle to protect their comrades or complete their objectives. But this was different. This was not the desperate courage of the battlefield, decisions made in seconds under fire. This was calm, deliberate, considered. 68 people, given time to think, given every opportunity to refuse, choosing instead to embrace their own deaths for the sake of strangers. Threx did not have a word in his own language for what he was feeling. He simply sat in silence, letting the recording continue, unable to look away, even as it grew harder and harder to listen. The next several entries were shorter, more practical, recorded in the hours leading up to the final engagement. Reyes reviewing tactical plans. Vasquez confirming reactor modifications across all 4 ships. Okafor overseeing the transfer of 60 non-essential crew members to the shuttlecraft, along with as many personal logs and letters as could be gathered in the limited time available, so that something, at least, might survive to reach the families left behind. Then came an entry unlike any of the others, recorded, according to the timestamp, only a few hours before the final battle. Captain's log, personal entry. Not for the official record. Reyes's voice was quieter than Threx had heard it before, stripped of the composure she had maintained throughout every previous recording. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this. I'm recording it anyway, because I think I need to say it, even if only to myself. I'm afraid. I haven't let myself feel that. Not really. Not since this all started, because I couldn't afford to. My crew needed a captain who believed we could win, or at least believed the fight was worth having, and I gave them that, because it was true. It is true. But underneath all of that, I'm afraid, and I think it's all right to admit that now, this close to the end. I keep thinking about my father's farm back on Earth, Nebraska, wide open sky, more stars visible at night than you'd believe possible, from a place with electric lights nearby. I used to lie in the grass as a kid, and look up at all that sky, and wonder what was out there. I never imagined it would be this. I never imagined I'd spend my life out here, fighting for people I'll never meet, dying for a cause I believe in, with my whole heart, but that I wish, more than anything, I didn't have to die for. If anyone ever hears this, human or otherwise, I want them to know that none of this was about hatred. I don't hate the Doran. I don't understand them, not really, not after 11 years of fighting them, but I don't hate them either. I think, somewhere in all of this, there's a version of events where we could have found another way. I don't know what that version looks like. I just know we didn't find it in time, and now 68 of us are about to die trying to buy a little more time for the people who come after us. I hope it was worth it. I have to believe it was worth it. That's the only way I know how to finish this. The recording ended. Threx sat in the darkness of his quarters for a long, long time, unable to move, unable to speak, the weight of everything he had just heard pressing down on him like something physical. He thought about the words Reyes had spoken. I don't hate the Doran. I don't understand them, not really, not after 11 years of fighting them, but I don't hate them either. He thought about his own feelings toward humanity, the casual contempt he had carried for 11 years without ever examining it, the assumption of superiority that had underpinned every strategic decision, every campaign, every order he had given. He had never once, in all that time, stopped to consider whether there might have been another way. He had simply accepted the war as an inevitable consequence of Doran expansion, humanity as an obstacle to be removed, and had gone about his duties with the same cold efficiency he applied to every other aspect of his military career. Sarah Reyes, facing her own death, had found room in her heart to wonder about a peace that had never come, to hope that her enemy might someday understand what her sacrifice had truly meant. Threx did not know what to do with that thought. He simply sat there, in the dark, and after a long while, he reached for the console one final time that night, and pressed play on what he already suspected would be the final entry in Sarah Reyes's log. The final entry began differently from all the others. There was noise in the background, the sound of alarms, distant and muffled, the low rumble of a ship under heavy strain. Sarah Reyes's voice, when it came, was rushed but clear. every word deliberate despite the chaos around her. Captain's log. Final entry. Engagement has begun. Enemy fleet fully committed to close-range formation, exactly as we hoped. Vasquez confirms reactor overload sequence is ready on all 4 ships. We are approximately 90 seconds from execution. A pause, filled with the sound of shouted commands in the background, other voices calling out status reports that Threx could not fully make out. To whoever finds this log, human or otherwise, my name is Sarah Reyes, Captain, United Earthships. I commanded the UES Meridian and what remained of the 4th Fleet's Kesson Corridor Defense Force. What we did here, we did to protect 17 mining colonies and the people who called them home. I don't know if we succeeded. I won't know, not really. Not from where I'm sitting right now. But I have to believe we did. I have to believe this mattered. To my crew, all of them, past and present, living and gone. It was the honor of my life to serve with you. I mean that with everything I have left to mean it with. 60 seconds. Another voice cut in briefly, urgent but calm. Threx recognized it as Vasquez. To my family, if this ever reaches you. I love you. I'm sorry I won't be coming home. I hope you know that everything I did because I believed it was right, and because I couldn't imagine living with myself if I'd chosen differently. 30 seconds. Vasquez's voice again, tighter now. Final log entry, UES Meridian. Reactor overload sequence, initiating on my mark. It has been an honor. Mark. There was a burst of static, sudden and violent, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence. The recording had ended. Threx sat motionless in the dark of his quarters for what felt like a very long time. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply sat with the silence, letting it settle over him the way it must have settled over the wreckage of the Meridian. In the moments after that final, desperate act, he knew, from Doran military records, roughly what had happened next, though the reports had never described it in anything approaching this kind of detail. The reactor overloads aboard the 4 remaining human ships had triggered a massive, coordinated energy discharge at the heart of the Doran fleet's formation. 19 Doran vessels had been destroyed outright. 6 more had been crippled beyond repair. Only 2 ships from the original 27 had escaped the engagement with minimal damage, and those 2 had been forced to retreat, their crews too shaken and their systems too depleted to continue the advance. The mining colonies had survived. All 17 of them, evacuated in time, their populations relocated to safer systems deep within human-controlled space. Threx had never made that connection before, had never once thought to ask why the Doran advance through the Kesson Corridor had stalled so completely, after what should have been a decisive victory. He understood now. 68 people had bought that time with their lives, and the official Doran reports had never once mentioned them by name. Threx rose from his chair slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and made his way to the small viewport in his quarters. Outside, the stars hung motionless in the void, indifferent to everything that had happened, everything that continued to happen, in the long, bloody war between his people and Sarah Reyes's people. He thought about the choice he now faced. He could file this discovery as classified intelligence, useful information about human tactics and psychology that might give the Doran fleet an advantage in future engagements. That was, technically, his duty as a Doran captain. That was what any of his superiors would expect him to do with a resource this valuable. But Threx found, standing there in the quiet of his own quarters, that he could not bring himself to think of Sarah Reyes's final words as merely a resource. He could not reduce 68 names and voices, 68 people who had chosen, with clear eyes and open hearts, to die for strangers, into a tactical advantage to be exploited in the next engagement. He returned to his desk and activated his personal terminal, drafting a message to Fleet Command, the kind of message that could end a career, or worse, depending on how it was received. He wrote for a long time, longer than he had written anything in years, describing not the tactical details of the Meridian. Yes, final stand, but the truth of what he had learned, that the war they had been fighting for 11 years was not a war against a weaker, disorganized enemy, destined for eventual conquest. It was a war against people who understood exactly what they were fighting for, people capable of extraordinary courage and extraordinary sacrifice, People who, given the chance, might have found a different path entirely. He did not know if the message would change anything. He did not know if his superiors would even read it with an open mind, or simply dismiss it as the confused sentimentality of a captain who had spent too many nights alone with a dead enemy's voice. But he sent it anyway, because he found he could not do otherwise, not after everything he had heard. In the days that followed, Threx ordered his crew to return to the wreck of the Meridian. One final time, he walked its silent corridors again, this time not as a conqueror inspecting a defeated enemy's ship, but as something closer to a mourner, paying respects to the dead. He found, in a sealed compartment near the medical bay, a small collection of physical letters, the ones Vasquez and Okafor had gathered before the final battle, meant for families that would never receive them through official channels. Threx made a decision then, one that surprised even himself. He had the letters carefully preserved, and he began, quietly, without informing his superiors, to search for ways to see them delivered. It would take months, he suspected, working through neutral channels and intermediaries, human relief organizations that still, even after 11 years of war, maintained some contact with sympathetic parties on the Doran side of the conflict. It might never fully succeed, but he intended to try. He also kept a copy of Sarah Reyes's logs, all 211 entries, stored securely in his own personal files, separate from any official record. He found himself returning to them sometimes, in quiet moments, listening again to a voice that had taught him more about courage and sacrifice, in a few weeks of recordings, than 11 years of war ever had. Threx Voss did not become a hero in this story, not in any grand or dramatic sense. He did not defect from the Doran fleet, did not lead a rebellion, did not single-handedly end the war between his people and Earth. He was, in the end, still a Doran captain, bound by duty and loyalty to a people and a cause he had served his entire life, and those bonds did not simply dissolve because of what he had learned aboard a dead ship. But something had changed in him, quietly, permanently. He began, in small ways that his superiors barely noticed, to argue for restraint in engagements where restraint was possible. He began to request, wherever military necessity allowed, that human prisoners be treated according to the same standards of dignity the Doran claimed to uphold among themselves. He began, slowly and carefully, to plant seeds of doubt among the officers under his command, telling them, when the moment seemed right, small pieces of what he had learned about the enemy they had spent so long dismissing as weak and disorganized. He did not know, and would never fully know, how much difference any of it made in the wider course of the war. Wars were vast, complicated things, shaped by forces far larger than any single captain's private conscience. But he had to believe, the way Sarah Reyes herself had chosen to believe in her final moments, that it mattered. That small acts of understanding, small refusals to accept easy hatred, added up eventually to something larger, something that might, given enough time, change the shape of a conflict that had already cost far too much on both sides. Years later, long after the war between Earth and the Doran Empire had finally, painfully, given way to an uneasy peace, historians on both sides would study the strange case of Captain Threx Voss, the Doran officer who had discovered the Meridian logs and who had, in his own quiet way, become one of the earliest voices arguing within Doran military circles for a different understanding of the human enemy. Some would credit him, perhaps too generously, with helping to shorten a war that might otherwise have dragged on for decades more. Others would simply note him as an interesting footnote, one officer among thousands whose personal choices left small, hard-to-measure ripples across a much larger conflict. But on human worlds, in a small archive maintained by the descendants of the 17 mining colonies that had once stood in the path of a Doran fleet, there existed a different kind of record. A collection of 211 audio logs, recovered decades after the war's end, through channels that historians still debated the origins of, alongside a small bundle of physical letters that had, against all odds, eventually found their way to the families they had always been meant for. Among the letters was a note, added much later, in a careful, unfamiliar hand, translated from a language that was not originally human. It read simply, "I do not know if this reaches anyone who will understand it. I found these words in the dark, aboard a ship I once thought was empty. I was wrong. It was never truly empty. It was full of the bravest people I have ever known. and I have carried their voices with me ever since. I am sorry it took so long, and cost so much, to learn what I learned aboard your ship. I hope, in whatever way such things can be hoped for across the distance between our two peoples, that it mattered. With respect, T. Voss. The logbook of the UES Meridian had done what no fleet, no weapon, no strategy had ever managed to accomplish in 11 years of war. It had reached across the vast, cold distance between two species who barely understood each other, and it had planted, in the heart of at least one enemy captain, a seed of understanding that no battle could ever have won on its own. Sarah Reyes had asked, in her final recorded words, to believe that her sacrifice had mattered. She would never know, not in any way she could have imagined at the time, just how far and how deep that belief would eventually prove true.